The night you choose to save a stranger may become the night destiny remembers your name. Rain poured relentlessly through the towering pines of Silverpine Forest, each heavy drop striking the forest floor with a rhythm that swallowed every ordinary sound beneath the storm. Abigail Carter pulled her worn gray cloak tighter around her shoulders as she carefully followed the narrow trail winding between ancient cedar trees, her leather boots sinking slightly into damp earth softened by hours of relentless rain. The cold mountain wind carried the scent of pine needles, wet moss, and distant wildflowers, yet beneath those familiar fragrances lingered something unfamiliar, something that made her pause despite the growing darkness surrounding her. It was not a scent she recognized. It felt older somehow, carrying sorrow instead of danger. Abigail tilted her head, listening carefully. At first she heard nothing except rain striking branches overhead. Then it came again. A faint, trembling whimper drifted through the storm before disappearing beneath another roll of distant thunder. Every instinct told her to continue walking. Sunset had vanished long ago, and everyone inside Black Hollow Pack knew the forest belonged to creatures far less forgiving after nightfall. Even the bravest hunters avoided wandering beneath the full moon when storms cloaked the mountains. Abigail lowered the basket of freshly gathered herbs from her shoulder and stood perfectly still. Another weak cry echoed through the trees. Softer this time. More exhausted than frightened. Her heart tightened before her thoughts had the chance to argue. She quietly left the safety of the narrow trail and stepped into the untouched forest, carefully pushing aside dripping branches while moonlight struggled to break through the thick canopy above. Rain soaked her chestnut hair within moments, loose strands clinging gently against her pale face as icy water slipped from leaf to leaf around her. The forest seemed strangely silent. No birds called. No insects sang. Even the wind had grown unusually cautious, as though every living thing nearby waited for someone to make the next choice. Abigail climbed over a fallen cedar trunk before noticing enormous paw prints pressed deeply into the muddy ground. They were unlike any wolf tracks she had ever seen. Each print measured nearly twice the size of an ordinary alpha's transformed form. She slowly followed them until they disappeared beneath tangled roots surrounding an ancient oak that had stood for centuries. There, hidden between exposed roots darkened by rain, lay a massive black wolf. His thick midnight fur was soaked completely through, making every slow breath painfully visible as his broad chest rose and fell against the cold earth. One powerful foreleg rested awkwardly beneath him while silver eyes, brighter than the moon itself, struggled to remain open. Abigail stopped breathing for a moment. She had seen wolves before, but never one like this. His size alone made him appear almost mythical, yet there was no anger in those extraordinary silver eyes. Only exhaustion. Only quiet pain carried with impossible dignity. The enormous wolf slowly lifted his head, meeting Abigail's frightened gaze without growling or retreating. For one suspended heartbeat neither of them moved. Rain continued falling between them like countless silver threads while distant thunder rolled across the valley. Abigail knew every lesson she had ever been taught. Never approach an unknown wolf. Never trust a black wolf wandering alone beneath a full moon. Never ignore the ancient warnings whispered by the elders since childhood. Yet none of those warnings resembled the living creature lying before her now. She saw no monster. She saw a wounded soul trying desperately to survive another night. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the herb basket before she quietly knelt several feet away, careful not to frighten him. The great wolf watched every movement without looking away. Then, just as Abigail reached for the clean linen tucked inside her basket, the silver crescent of moonlight broke through the storm clouds above, illuminating the wolf's eyes with a brilliance so hauntingly familiar that she felt, without understanding why, as though this impossible meeting had been waiting for her long before either of them had entered the forest. The great black wolf did not move. Rain continued flowing over his thick midnight fur, collecting along the powerful curve of his shoulders before disappearing into the soaked earth beneath him. Abigail Carter remained kneeling several feet away, her basket of herbs resting beside her as her heartbeat echoed louder than the distant thunder rolling across the mountains. Every lesson she had learned since childhood urged her to leave. Black Hollow Pack had repeated the same warning for generations. black wolves wandering beyond the borders carried misfortune. No Omega was to approach them. No healer was to offer aid. No one was to interfere with whatever fate had already chosen. Abigail knew every word of those old teachings, yet the creature before her did not resemble the terrifying legends whispered around winter fires. His silver eyes held no hunger. They held exhaustion. Quiet endurance. The kind of silent suffering she understood all too well. Slowly, without making any sudden movement, Abigail opened the cloth covering her basket and removed a small bundle of clean linen along with a pouch filled with dried herbs gathered earlier that afternoon. The familiar scent of lavender, yarrow, and pine resin drifted into the cool air, briefly overpowering the smell of rain. She kept her voice gentle, speaking more to calm herself than the enormous wolf watching her every movement. "I am not here to hurt you." The words disappeared almost immediately into the storm, yet something changed inside the wolf's expression. His ears relaxed ever so slightly, and the tension that had held his broad shoulders slowly eased. Abigail noticed the smallest details because years spent helping injured animals and frightened children had taught her that healing often began long before medicine touched a wound. Trust came first. Everything else followed. She carefully stretched one hand forward, stopping well beyond his reach, giving him complete freedom to refuse. For several long seconds neither of them moved. Rain dripped steadily from low cedar branches while cold wind stirred fallen leaves across the forest floor. Then the massive wolf did something completely unexpected. Instead of retreating deeper beneath the tangled roots, he slowly lowered his head onto the damp earth without ever breaking eye contact. It was not surrender. It was permission. Abigail released a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding. Moving with patient care, she inched closer until she could finally see what the darkness had hidden before. Thick black fur along one side of his body had become tangled with mud and broken branches, making it difficult for him to move comfortably. She gently brushed away wet leaves without causing unnecessary discomfort. The wolf remained remarkably still, watching her with calm silver eyes that seemed almost impossibly intelligent. Abigail frowned softly. "You have been alone for a long time, have you not?" she whispered. The great wolf blinked once, slowly, as though he somehow understood every word. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it filled her with unexpected sadness. She had spent most of her own life feeling invisible inside Black Hollow, overlooked because she chose kindness over strength and healing over fighting. Looking into those ancient silver eyes, she recognized the same loneliness reflected back at her. It was not the loneliness of being physically alone. It was the deeper loneliness of carrying a burden no one else could truly understand. Abigail carefully dipped a clean strip of linen into the rainwater collected inside a smooth stone hollow before gently wiping away layers of mud from the wolf's dark fur. The simple act felt strangely familiar, almost peaceful despite the storm surrounding them. As the mud disappeared beneath slow, careful movements, she noticed something that made her hands freeze. Hidden beneath the soaked black fur rested an intricately crafted silver clasp woven into a narrow leather band around the wolf's neck. It was unlike anything made inside Black Hollow. Even beneath rain and years of wear, the workmanship reflected extraordinary craftsmanship, bearing the unmistakable elegance of someone who had once belonged far beyond an ordinary forest. Abigail stared at the mysterious clasp for only a heartbeat before lifting her eyes back toward the wolf, whose calm silver gaze never once left her face. Abigail's fingertips hovered only inches from the finely crafted silver clasp before she quietly pulled her hand away. Something about the intricate design stirred a faint memory buried deep within stories her late mother had once whispered beside the fireplace on cold winter evenings. Royal families, traveling emissaries, and legendary guardians sometimes carried symbols unlike anything found inside ordinary packs. Yet those had always sounded like distant fairy tales, far removed from the lonely life of an overlooked Omega living on the edge of Black Hollow. She looked back into the great wolf's silver eyes. He watched her with extraordinary stillness, neither encouraging nor resisting her curiosity. It was almost as though he had already accepted whatever decision she would make next. The rain gradually softened into a steady drizzle, allowing thin beams of moonlight to filter through the towering cedar branches overhead. Abigail carefully reached into her basket once more, removing a small clay jar sealed with wax. She gently opened it, releasing the familiar scent of pine resin blended with crushed calendula and mountain herbs she had prepared only a few days earlier. It was one of her strongest healing salves, made from recipes passed down by her mother long before Abigail had become the village's quiet, forgotten healer. She glanced toward the enormous wolf with gentle hesitation. "This may sting for a moment," she whispered softly, smiling almost apologetically. "But it will help." The wolf remained perfectly still. Encouraged by his calmness, Abigail slowly leaned closer and carefully brushed aside the damp fur surrounding the injured area. She worked with practiced patience, never rushing, allowing the animal complete trust over every movement. Her hands remained remarkably steady despite the unusual size of the creature before her. Years spent tending frightened livestock, injured birds, and abandoned forest animals had taught her that fear often spread from healer to patient. Calmness could become its own kind of medicine. As she gently spread the herbal salve across the injured area hidden beneath the thick black fur, the wolf briefly closed his eyes. A quiet breath escaped him, not from pain, but from unmistakable relief. Abigail smiled without realizing it. "There," she murmured. "That feels a little better, does it not?" The great wolf slowly opened his silver eyes again. For the briefest instant, Abigail could have sworn she saw gratitude shining within them, so deeply human that it sent an unexpected chill down her spine. She quickly reminded herself that exhaustion and moonlight often played tricks on tired minds. Even so, she found herself speaking to him exactly as she would another person. "You should not have been alone out here." The forest answered only with gentle rain dripping from branches overhead. Then, unexpectedly, the wolf slowly shifted his massive body, making room beneath the shelter of the ancient oak roots. It was a subtle movement, almost courteous, leaving just enough dry ground beside him for another person to sit protected from the worst of the rain. Abigail blinked in surprise before quietly laughing to herself. "Now I know I have spent too much time alone," she whispered. "I am beginning to imagine wolves inviting me to sit beside them." Yet something inside her refused to dismiss the gesture as coincidence. She carefully settled onto the dry patch of earth, wrapping her damp cloak tightly around her shoulders while the old oak shielded them both from the remaining drizzle. For several peaceful moments, neither spoke because neither needed to. The silence felt strangely comforting instead of awkward. Abigail watched the moon slowly emerge between drifting storm clouds while the great black wolf rested quietly beside her. Somewhere beyond the forest, distant church bells echoed from Black Hollow, signaling that curfew had begun. She knew the elders would already be warning everyone to stay indoors until morning. Anyone caught wandering the forest after dark would face difficult questions. Anyone discovered protecting an unknown black wolf would almost certainly be cast out forever. Abigail closed her eyes briefly, listening to the bells fade into the mountains. When she opened them again, she looked toward the quiet creature beside her and realized that despite every warning she had ever heard, she no longer wanted to leave him alone. The last echoes of the village bells disappeared beyond the mountains, leaving only the gentle rhythm of rain dripping from the ancient oak above them. Abigail Carter remained seated beside the great black wolf, her damp cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders while the cool night air settled across the forest. She should have been walking home long ago. By morning the elders would notice she had missed curfew, and questions would spread through Black Hollow faster than smoke on a windy afternoon. Yet every time she imagined standing up and leaving, her eyes drifted back to the enormous creature resting quietly beside her. He looked less like a predator now and more like someone who had carried an unbearable burden for far too long. Abigail reached into her basket once again, removing a small loaf of coarse bread wrapped carefully inside linen along with a wooden flask filled with fresh spring water she always carried during long days gathering herbs. She broke the bread into smaller pieces before placing them gently upon a flat stone nearby. "I do not know whether wolves enjoy bread," she said with a quiet smile. "But it is all I have tonight." The great wolf slowly lifted his head. His silver eyes studied the simple offering before looking back at Abigail. Instead of eating immediately, he remained completely still, almost as though waiting for permission he did not need. Abigail softly laughed under her breath. You really do have remarkable manners. Only after she nodded encouragingly did the wolf carefully lower his head and accept the food with surprising gentleness. There was nothing hurried or desperate about the way he ate. Every movement reflected unusual patience, so unlike the wild animals Abigail had treated over the years that she found herself watching with growing curiosity. Even the way he accepted the wooden flask after she carefully tilted it toward him felt strangely deliberate, almost graceful. She shook her head in quiet disbelief. You are making it very difficult to believe you are an ordinary wolf. The creature blinked slowly before looking away toward the moonlit forest. Abigail followed his gaze. Silver light now spilled freely between the towering cedars as the storm finally drifted eastward, revealing countless stars beginning to appear above the mountains. The peaceful silence surrounding them should have felt comforting, yet something deep inside the forest had changed. The air itself seemed to tighten. Abigail noticed it first through the birds. Earlier the woods had been silent because of the rain. Now, despite clear skies, not a single night bird sang. Even the breeze moving through the pine branches had grown strangely cautious. The great wolf sensed it at the exact same moment. His ears lifted sharply. His silver eyes focused into the darkness beyond the old oak, every trace of peaceful exhaustion disappearing beneath quiet alertness. Abigail immediately understood that something unseen had entered the forest. She listened carefully but heard nothing unusual. What is it? She whispered almost instinctively, forgetting for a moment that she was speaking to a wolf. He slowly stood despite obvious fatigue, placing himself between Abigail and the deeper woods without hesitation. His massive frame blocked her view of the shadowed trail ahead while his thick black fur caught the silver moonlight like polished obsidian. Abigail's heartbeat quickened. She trusted his instincts far more than her own. Then, carried gently across the cool night air, came the unmistakable sound of distant voices. Human voices. Faint at first, then gradually clearer. Someone called another hunter's name. Another answered. The soft glow of lantern light flickered between distant trees, moving steadily closer through the darkness. Abigail felt her stomach tighten. Black Hollow hunting parties never entered Silverpine after curfew unless they were searching for something they believed dangerous. She looked toward the great wolf. He remained perfectly still, his silver eyes never leaving the approaching lights. For one long heartbeat neither of them moved. Then the wolf slowly turned his head toward Abigail and looked directly into her eyes, as though silently asking a question that would change both of their lives before the night was over. The lantern lights drifting through the trees grew brighter with every passing moment, their warm glow weaving between towering cedar trunks like restless fireflies searching the darkness. Abigail Carter slowly rose from the shelter beneath the ancient oak, her heart beating faster as the distant voices became easier to recognize. They belonged to hunters from Black Hollow. She had known most of them since childhood. They were not cruel men, but they obeyed the elders without question, especially when ancient laws were involved. If they discovered a black wolf hidden this deep inside Silverpine Forest, they would not stop to wonder why he had come here or whether he needed help. They would simply believe they were protecting the pack. Abigail looked toward the great wolf standing quietly before her. Moonlight reflected across his soaked black fur while his silver eyes remained fixed upon the approaching lights. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he held himself with remarkable composure. There was no panic in his expression. No desperation. Only calm readiness, as though he had accepted difficult choices long before this night had begun. Abigail lowered her voice to little more than a whisper. They cannot find you. The wolf slowly turned his head toward her. For one silent heartbeat, those extraordinary silver eyes met hers again, carrying an intelligence that no ordinary animal should have possessed. Abigail felt the same strange certainty she had sensed from the beginning. Somehow he understood every word. She glanced around the old oak until she noticed a narrow opening hidden behind a curtain of ivy-covered roots. Years earlier she had discovered the small hollow while gathering herbs during the spring thaw. Thick branches and tangled vines concealed it so completely that someone could walk within a few feet without ever noticing it. She stepped toward the hidden space before looking back at the wolf. "Come with me." Without hesitation, the great wolf followed. Though his movements remained careful because of his weakened condition, he walked with surprising silence for such a massive creature. Together they slipped behind the ancient roots just as beams of lantern light swept across the clearing where they had been resting only moments before. Abigail gently pulled loose branches back into place, leaving only tiny openings through which she could watch the approaching hunters. 4 men entered the clearing carrying wooden lanterns that cast long golden shadows across the wet forest floor. One knelt beside the muddy paw prints while another studied the disturbed ground beneath the old oak. "The tracks stop here," one hunter murmured. "Whatever left these prints cannot have gone far." Another shook his head uneasily. "The elders warned us that a cursed black wolf was seen crossing the northern ridge before the storm. We must be careful." Abigail instinctively held her breath. Beside her, the great wolf remained perfectly still. She could hear his slow breathing, steady and controlled despite the danger only a few yards away. Her shoulder lightly brushed against his thick fur inside the narrow shelter, and she was surprised by the comforting warmth that radiated from him despite the cold night air. The hunters searched the clearing carefully but found nothing except scattered herbs, damp footprints softened by rain, and the empty place where the wolf had rested. After several tense minutes, their leader slowly lowered his lantern. "The storm erased the trail," he said with reluctant disappointment. "We will continue at first light." One by one the lanterns disappeared back into the darkness until only moonlight remained beneath the old oak. Abigail waited several more moments before quietly releasing the breath she had been holding. She smiled with visible relief and gently leaned back against the rough bark. "You are safe now," she whispered. The great wolf looked at her for a long moment before slowly lowering his massive head beside her knees in complete trust. Abigail hesitated only briefly before carefully resting one hand upon the soft black fur between his ears. Instead of pulling away, the wolf peacefully closed his silver eyes, and somewhere deep inside the quiet forest, the first faint feeling of home began awakening in 2 lonely hearts that had spent far too many years facing the world alone. Dawn arrived quietly over Silver Pine Forest, painting the mist between the towering pines with soft ribbons of gold and silver while the last traces of the night storm disappeared beyond the distant mountains. Abigail Carter had not realized she had fallen asleep until the warmth of early sunlight touched her face. She slowly opened her eyes beneath the shelter of the ancient oak and found the great black wolf still lying only a few feet away, watching the sunrise through the trees with calm silver eyes. He looked noticeably stronger than he had the night before. His breathing had become steady, and the quiet exhaustion that had clouded his expression seemed lighter now, replaced by silent awareness. Abigail smiled with genuine relief before reaching into her basket to inspect the remaining herbs. She carefully mixed fresh pine resin with crushed camphor leaves inside a small wooden bowl, adding a few drops of spring water until the familiar healing salve reached the proper consistency. As she worked, she glanced toward the wolf and quietly laughed to herself. "You are going to need one more treatment before I let you pretend you are fully recovered." The great wolf slowly turned his head toward her. To Abigail's surprise, he calmly walked across the clearing without hesitation before sitting beside her exactly where she had prepared the medicine, almost as though he understood the routine. She shook her head with amused disbelief. "You truly are the most patient I have ever met." Kneeling beside him, Abigail gently brushed aside the thick black fur where she had applied the herbal salve during the storm. The area already looked remarkably healthier. She frowned slightly, studying it with careful curiosity. No ordinary wolf healed this quickly. Even the strongest alphas required several days before showing such improvement. Yet she dismissed the thought before allowing herself to wander too far into impossible explanations. Nature often surprised those willing to observe it closely. She carefully applied another thin layer of medicine, her movements slow and practiced, while the wolf remained perfectly still beneath her gentle touch. Once she finished, Abigail noticed several burrs tangled deep within his damp fur along one shoulder. Smiling softly, she began removing them one by one with patient fingers. "You certainly know how to find every thorn in the forest," she whispered. The wolf lowered his head slightly, allowing her easier access without the slightest resistance. The simple trust between them no longer felt unusual. It felt natural, as though an invisible bridge had quietly formed during the long night they had shared beneath the ancient oak. A cool breeze drifted through the clearing carrying the fragrance of fresh cedar, wild mint, and sun-warmed earth. Abigail breathed deeply, enjoying a rare moment of peace untouched by judgment or loneliness. Then she noticed something unexpected. Resting upon the moss near the wolf's front paws lay a beautifully crafted silver ring engraved with the same elegant design she had seen on the mysterious clasp around his neck. She blinked in surprise. The ring had not been there the night before. Carefully picking it up, she turned it between her fingers. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, unlike anything created inside Black Hollow. Tiny symbols encircled the polished silver band with remarkable precision, surrounding the image of a crescent moon embraced by a noble wolf. Abigail looked toward the great wolf. "Is this yours?" she asked softly. He gazed quietly at the ring before meeting her eyes once more. Something in his expression changed, becoming almost wistful, as though the small piece of silver carried memories too heavy for words. Abigail slipped the ring safely into the small pocket inside her cloak. "I will keep it safe until you are ready to take it back." The wolf slowly inclined his head in the smallest gesture that somehow felt unmistakably like gratitude. At that exact moment, carried gently across the still morning air, came the distant sound of a hunting horn echoing from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge. It rang only once, yet the great black wolf immediately rose to his feet. His silver eyes sharpened toward the horizon, and for the first time since Abigail had found him, she saw not an injured wanderer standing before her, but someone who had suddenly remembered exactly who he was. The clear morning air carried the distant sound of the hunting horn across Silverpine Forest a second time, its low echo drifting through the towering pines until every bird that had only moments earlier welcomed the sunrise suddenly fell silent. Abigail Carter slowly stood, instinctively brushing pine needles from her faded dress while watching the great black wolf. The peaceful calm that had settled over him throughout the morning had quietly disappeared. His silver eyes remained fixed toward the eastern ridge with unwavering concentration, and every muscle beneath his dark coat seemed to awaken with quiet purpose. Abigail had never seen such remarkable composure in any animal. He was not frightened. He was preparing. She stepped closer, following his gaze toward the distant hills where sunlight now painted the highest treetops in soft gold. "Someone is searching again," she whispered. The wolf neither moved nor looked away. After several long moments, he finally turned back toward Abigail. There was something different in his expression now. The quiet loneliness she had recognized during the storm remained, but another emotion rested beside it. It resembled reluctant acceptance, as though he understood that the peaceful hours they had shared beneath the ancient oak could not last forever. Abigail reached into the pocket of her cloak and gently touched the silver ring she had promised to protect. The polished metal still felt unexpectedly warm against her fingertips. She looked back toward the wolf and smiled softly. "Whatever happens, your secret is safe with me." The great wolf slowly stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. He lowered his head slightly, not from weakness but from unmistakable trust. Abigail carefully rested her hand once more against the thick fur between his ears. The familiar warmth beneath her fingertips made it difficult to believe they had met only the night before. It felt as though the quiet bond between them had grown naturally with every shared silence, every patient glance, and every simple act of kindness that expected nothing in return. The hunting horn echoed again, closer this time. It was soon followed by faint voices carried gently through the forest. Abigail recognized one of them immediately. It belonged to Thomas Reed, one of Black Hollow's senior trackers. If Thomas was leading the search, they would eventually find every hidden trail inside Silverpine. She looked around the clearing, realizing there was no longer enough time to remain hidden beneath the old oak. The wolf seemed to reach the same conclusion. Instead of retreating deeper into the woods, he calmly stepped in front of Abigail once again, placing himself between her and the direction of the approaching voices. She frowned with quiet concern. "You should be protecting yourself, not me." the wolf slowly looked back over one shoulder. His silver eyes held a calm certainty that left Abigail momentarily speechless. Then, in a gesture so unexpectedly gentle that her heart tightened, he lightly brushed the side of his face against her shoulder before stepping away. It lasted only a heartbeat, yet it carried more gratitude than words ever could. Abigail watched him begin walking toward the deeper forest, his powerful stride noticeably stronger than it had been during the storm. Halfway across the clearing he stopped, turned, and looked back at her one final time. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall cedars, illuminating his midnight fur with a faint silver glow that made him appear almost unreal against the quiet woodland. Abigail instinctively took one step forward. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked softly, knowing no answer could come. The wolf remained still for another long moment before lifting his head toward the bright morning sky. A single clear howl rose through the peaceful valley, rich with quiet strength rather than sorrow, echoing across mountains bathed in golden light. When the sound finally faded into the distance, the great black wolf disappeared silently between the ancient pines just seconds before the first members of the Black Hollow search party emerged into the clearing where Abigail now stood alone, still holding the warmth of an impossible friendship deep within her heart. The echo of the wolf's farewell faded into the mountains just as Thomas Reed stepped into the clearing, his weathered boots pressing softly against the rain-darkened earth. 3 other hunters followed behind him carrying wooden staffs and unlit lanterns now unnecessary beneath the bright morning sun. Their eyes immediately settled upon Abigail Carter standing alone beneath the ancient oak, her herb basket resting beside her feet while dew shimmered across the surrounding ferns. Thomas lowered his gaze toward the enormous paw prints still visible in patches of softened ground. His expression tightened with quiet concern. "Abigail," he said carefully, "have you been here all night?" She hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "Yes." One of the younger hunters looked around the clearing. "The tracks lead directly here." Another pointed toward the broad impressions left beneath the old roots. "Something large rested in this place." Abigail instinctively slipped one hand into the pocket of her cloak where the silver ring remained safely hidden. She could still feel its smooth edge resting against her fingertips. Thomas stepped closer, his voice calm rather than accusing. "Did you see the black wolf?" Abigail met his eyes without lowering her own. "I did." The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas sighed quietly. The elders feared that answer. Abigail's heartbeat quickened, yet her voice remained steady. "He was injured." One of the younger men frowned. "You should have left immediately." Abigail gently shook her head. "He needed help." Silence settled over the clearing. No one raised their voice. No one argued. Yet the difference between duty and compassion suddenly stood plainly between them. Thomas studied Abigail for a long moment before speaking again. "You know the old law. Anyone who shelters a cursed black wolf risks exile from the pack." Abigail looked toward the quiet forest where the great wolf had disappeared only moments earlier. Sunlight now poured peacefully between the towering cedars as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened there. She remembered the patient silver eyes that had watched her with impossible understanding, the careful way he had accepted bread from her hand, and the gentle gesture of gratitude before he left. None of those memories resembled the terrifying stories repeated by frightened elders. She turned back toward Thomas. "If showing kindness is enough to make me unworthy of my home," she answered softly, "then perhaps the law has forgotten why it was written." None of the hunters replied immediately. Thomas lowered his eyes, visibly troubled by her words. He had known Abigail since she was a little girl gathering herbs beside her mother. He also knew she had never acted from selfishness. Before he could answer, another sound drifted through the forest. It was not the hunting horn this time. It was the rhythmic thunder of many horses approaching from the southern road beyond the trees. Every hunter instinctively turned toward the sound. Dust rose above the distant trail where sunlight broke through the forest edge, revealing flashes of polished silver armor moving between the pines. Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Royal riders," he murmured in disbelief. The procession grew clearer with every passing moment. Tall banners embroidered with the silver wolf crest fluttered above a disciplined column of mounted guards whose elegant uniforms belonged not to Black Hollow, but to the royal kingdom itself. No royal escort had visited this remote valley in many years. The hunters stepped aside instinctively as the first riders entered the forest path. At their center rode a tall man dressed in a charcoal traveling coat trimmed with silver, his posture calm, his presence commanding without effort. Abigail watched from beneath the ancient oak, unable to explain why the moment the stranger lifted his eyes toward her, she felt the same quiet certainty she had experienced beneath the storm when a wounded black wolf had first looked into her heart with those unforgettable silver eyes. The royal procession came to a graceful halt at the edge of the clearing, and an almost reverent silence settled over Silver Pine Forest. Sunlight filtered through the towering cedars, reflecting softly from polished silver armor and the embroidered wolf crest carried upon deep blue banners that stirred gently in the morning breeze. The mounted guards remained perfectly still, their discipline evident without a single command being spoken. At the center of the procession, the tall stranger slowly guided his dark horse forward before stepping onto the forest floor with calm confidence. His charcoal traveling coat fell neatly to his knees, silver embroidery catching the morning light with understated elegance. Dark hair framed a composed face marked by quiet strength rather than severity, while remarkable silver eyes surveyed the clearing with careful attention. Abigail Carter felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside her chest the moment those eyes met hers. Something about them stirred a memory that refused to become clear. Thomas Reed immediately lowered his head in respect. The other hunters quickly followed. Abigail hesitated only a heartbeat before doing the same, uncertain of the stranger's identity but recognizing the unmistakable dignity surrounding him. The traveler acknowledged the hunters with a gentle nod before his attention returned to Abigail. His expression softened almost imperceptibly, as though simply seeing her standing safely beneath the ancient oak brought him unexpected relief. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and warm despite carrying effortless authority. Abigail lifted her eyes. "Good morning, sir." He glanced briefly around the clearing, his gaze resting upon the enormous paw prints still visible in the damp earth before quietly asking, "May I ask whether you spent the night here?" Abigail looked toward the old oak, remembering the long hours beneath its shelter, the healing herbs, the quiet companionship, and the silver eyes that had watched every careful movement she made. "Yes," she answered honestly. "I did." The stranger's expression remained thoughtful. "Alone?" Abigail paused. The hunters waited silently behind her. She could have hidden the truth. She could have pretended the wolf had never existed. Instead, she gently shook her head. "No." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, already anticipating where the conversation might lead. The stranger continued with remarkable patience. "Then you found the black wolf everyone has been searching for." Abigail nodded once. "He was injured." "And what did you choose to do?" She looked directly into the stranger's silver eyes before answering without regret. "I helped him." A quiet breeze passed through the clearing, stirring fallen leaves around their feet. None of the royal guards reacted. None of the hunters interrupted. The stranger simply continued studying Abigail with growing admiration that he made no effort to hide. "Did you know who he was?" he asked gently. Abigail smiled with quiet sadness. "No." "Were you afraid?" She thought carefully before answering. "At first, yes." The stranger inclined his head slightly. "Then why stay?" Abigail looked toward the distant forest where the black wolf had disappeared only a short while earlier. Her voice remained soft, yet every word carried complete sincerity. "Because pain does not become less real simply because others are afraid of it." He needed kindness more than judgment. The clearing became perfectly silent. Even the wind seemed to pause among the towering pines. The stranger lowered his eyes for a brief moment, as though absorbing every word with unexpected gratitude. Then he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal coat and withdrew a familiar silver ring engraved with the royal wolf crest. Abigail's breath caught instantly. Her hand moved instinctively to the pocket of her cloak where the matching ring still rested exactly where she had placed it. She stared at the stranger in complete disbelief as he gently turned the ring in his fingers, allowing the morning sunlight to illuminate the identical crescent engraving she had protected since dawn. Before she could ask a single question, the stranger looked into her eyes once more, and the quiet warmth within his silver gaze suddenly felt hauntingly familiar, exactly like the impossible eyes that had watched her through the storm beneath the ancient oak. Abigail's fingers slowly closed around the silver ring hidden inside her cloak, and for a brief moment she forgot the hunters, the royal guards, and even the quiet forest surrounding them. The ring in the stranger's hand was identical in every detail. The same crescent moon. The same finely carved wolf. The same graceful craftsmanship no village artisan could have created. Her heartbeat quickened as countless questions rushed through her mind at once. The stranger noticed the uncertainty in her eyes and offered a calm, reassuring smile. "You have something that belongs to me," he said gently. Abigail hesitated only a moment before carefully removing the matching ring from her pocket. Morning sunlight reflected across the polished silver as she placed it in her open palm. Soft murmurs spread among the hunters standing behind her. Even Thomas Reed looked visibly surprised. The stranger stepped closer, never rushing, his movements measured and respectful. When he held his own ring beside Abigail's, the matching engravings aligned perfectly, completing the image of a full moon embraced by two noble wolves. No magical light appeared. No miracle interrupted the quiet morning. The rings simply fit together with the unmistakable precision of two pieces crafted by the same royal hand many years before. The stranger looked at Abigail with unmistakable gratitude. "Thank you for protecting it." Abigail searched his face, studying the familiar silver eyes that had quietly haunted her thoughts since sunrise. Suddenly she understood why they felt so familiar. The gentle patience. The calm intelligence. The silent gratitude. They had never belonged to a stranger. They had belonged to the great black wolf resting beneath the ancient oak. She drew one slow breath. "It was you." The words escaped almost as a whisper. The stranger inclined his head. "Yes." Silence settled across the clearing. Thomas Reed stared in complete disbelief while the other hunters exchanged uncertain glances. Abigail continued looking into the stranger's eyes, almost afraid to ask the question waiting inside her heart. "Who are you?" Before the stranger could answer, every member of the royal escort stepped forward in perfect unison. Without a spoken command, they lowered themselves onto one knee, heads bowed with complete respect. Captain of the Royal Guard removed his polished helmet and spoke in a clear voice that echoed gently through the quiet forest. "Your Majesty, the escort stands ready." The words seemed to stop time itself. Thomas Reed immediately dropped to one knee. The remaining hunters quickly followed, their expressions shifting from confusion to astonishment. Abigail remained standing, not from disrespect, but because surprise had rooted her to the forest floor. She looked from the kneeling guards back to the quiet man before her. The impossible truth slowly settled into place. The stranger she had welcomed without fear, the wounded wolf she had sheltered through the storm, the patient companion who had accepted bread from her hands, stood before her not as an ordinary traveler, but as Nathaniel Blackwood, the Alpha King himself. Nathaniel's silver eyes never left hers. There was no distance in his expression despite the royal title now surrounding him. Only quiet appreciation. He took one measured step forward and placed a hand gently over his heart. "Abigail Carter," he said with calm sincerity, "while others feared what they did not understand, you chose compassion. While the world saw only a cursed black wolf, you saw a life worth saving." His voice remained steady, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. "You did not simply help a stranger survive the storm." He paused briefly before offering the smallest, warmest smile she had seen since their first impossible meeting beneath the ancient oak. "You saved your king." The forest remained wrapped in complete silence after Nathaniel Blackwood's words settled across the clearing. Sunlight filtered gently through the towering cedar branches, illuminating drifting dust and tiny drops of rain still clinging to emerald leaves. Abigail Carter stood motionless, searching the face of the man before her as memories from the previous night quietly rearranged themselves inside her mind. Every calm glance beneath the ancient oak. Every patient movement while she cleaned the mud from thick black fur. Every quiet moment when those remarkable silver eyes had followed her with silent understanding. Nothing had been imagined. It had always been him. Nathaniel noticed the disbelief lingering in her expression, yet he made no attempt to hurry her understanding. He had spent years carrying burdens that demanded patience, and this moment deserved the same respect. Thomas Reed slowly rose from one knee, still unable to hide the astonishment on his weathered face. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the elders taught us that the cursed black wolf wandered these forests alone because no one could break the ancient curse." Nathaniel turned toward the hunters with calm dignity. "The curse was never broken by strength." His voice carried no resentment, only quiet honesty. "It endured because fear convinced everyone to stay away." Abigail listened without speaking. Nathaniel looked back toward her, the warmth in his silver eyes unchanged from the night before. "Many believed the curse transformed me into something beyond saving during every full moon. Most fled the moment they saw the black wolf. Others sent hunters. Some simply closed their doors and hoped the legend would disappear." He paused briefly before offering a grateful smile. "You were the first person who looked beyond the curse itself." Abigail lowered her eyes for a moment, remembering the cold rain, the trembling whimper beneath the old oak, and the simple decision that had changed everything. "I only saw someone who needed help," she answered softly. Nathaniel inclined his head with quiet admiration. "Exactly." The Alpha King slowly reached toward the leather band resting around his wrist and carefully unfastened it. Woven into the dark leather rested the same elegant silver clasp Abigail had noticed hidden beneath the wolf's fur during the storm. He held it gently in his open hand before offering it to her. "You recognized this before you recognized me." Abigail accepted the clasp with careful fingers, studying the intricate craftsmanship beneath the morning light. The tiny crescent and noble wolf engraved into the silver matched the rings perfectly. They were not symbols of power alone. They were reminders of promises carried across generations. Captain Elias Bennett, commander of the royal escort, stepped forward respectfully holding an ancient leather journal protected inside a weathered case. Nathaniel accepted it before opening the first page. Carefully pressed between its pages rested several faded wildflowers. Abigail immediately recognized them. They were the same mountain blossoms growing beside her cottage, flowers her mother had always gathered because they survived even the harshest winters. Nathaniel gently closed the journal again. "My mother once believed these flowers represented quiet courage," he said. "She often said the strongest hearts rarely announce themselves." Abigail smiled sadly. "My mother used to say something very similar." For a brief moment neither spoke. They simply shared the unexpected comfort of two childhood memories that somehow reached across entirely different lives. Around them, the hunters no longer looked toward Abigail with suspicion. Instead, quiet respect gradually replaced old assumptions. Thomas lowered his head thoughtfully, realizing that the woman many had overlooked had accomplished what no warrior, elder, or alpha had managed in years. She had restored hope simply by refusing to let compassion surrender to fear. Nathaniel looked toward the peaceful forest where the storm had first brought them together before returning his eyes to Abigail. "The curse has finally ended," he said quietly. "Not because destiny chose me, but because kindness chose first." The gentle breeze that moved through Silver Pine Forest carried away the last trace of tension, leaving only the peaceful sound of rustling cedar branches and distant birds returning to the morning sky. Abigail Carter looked around the quiet clearing, noticing how differently every familiar face regarded her now. Only hours earlier, many of the hunters would have questioned her judgment for protecting a wounded black wolf. Now they stood in thoughtful silence, their eyes filled not with suspicion but with quiet respect. Thomas Reed slowly stepped toward her, removing his weathered hat before lowering his head. The simple gesture carried more meaning than any speech he could have given. "Abigail," he said softly, "I believed I understood courage because I had spent my life tracking dangerous trails through these mountains. Today I learned that real courage sometimes looks like choosing kindness when every rule tells you to walk away." Abigail smiled gently, almost embarrassed by the attention. I did not feel brave, she admitted. I only could not leave someone alone. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps that is exactly what bravery is. Nathaniel Blackwood quietly watched the exchange without interrupting. Throughout years of leading the kingdom, he had witnessed countless displays of strength, loyalty, and discipline. Yet nothing had moved him more deeply than the quiet humility standing before him now. Abigail had not helped the wounded wolf because she expected recognition. She had believed she was protecting someone the world had forgotten. That simple truth made her compassion impossible to imitate. Captain Elias Bennet stepped beside the Alpha King. Your Majesty, he said respectfully, the council will soon expect your return to the capital. Nathaniel acknowledged the reminder with a small nod before turning once more toward Abigail. There is something I wish to ask before we leave. She met his calm silver eyes with quiet curiosity. Nathaniel smiled gently. When you found me beneath the ancient oak, you knew nothing about my title. You believed I was only a frightened creature struggling to survive the storm. Abigail nodded. Yes. If you had known I was the Alpha King, would you have treated me differently? She considered the question carefully before answering with complete honesty. No. Nathaniel's smile quietly deepened. I hoped that would be your answer. Abigail looked down briefly before speaking again. May I ask you something as well? Of course. Now that the curse has ended, are you finally free? Nathaniel looked toward the brilliant morning sky beyond the towering pines. Sunlight drifted peacefully across the forest where fear had ruled for far too many years. He drew a slow breath before answering. The curse may be gone. His voice remained calm and thoughtful. But every ruler carries responsibilities that never truly disappear. Abigail understood more than his words alone. She recognized the quiet loneliness hidden beneath the dignity of leadership, just as he had recognized the quiet loneliness beneath her kindness. Neither tried to solve the other's burdens. They simply understood them. Nathaniel carefully removed the charcoal traveling cloak from his shoulders and folded it before offering it to Abigail. The mornings in these mountains can still be cold, he said with a gentle smile. Abigail hesitated. I cannot accept something that belongs to the king. Nathaniel shook his head softly. It belonged to the wounded traveler you sheltered through the storm before it ever belonged to a king. Abigail accepted the cloak with grateful hands. The rich fabric carried the familiar scent of cedar, rain, and the quiet night beneath the ancient oak. For reasons she could not fully explain, it already felt less like a royal gift and more like the memory of an unexpected friendship. Around them, the hunters and royal guards quietly prepared their horses while the peaceful forest welcomed another ordinary morning. Yet everyone standing beneath those towering pines understood that nothing about this day would ever be ordinary again. Because one simple act of compassion had changed not only the life of a forgotten traveler, but the heart of an entire kingdom. The royal procession slowly prepared to depart as sunlight climbed higher above Silverpine Forest, transforming the rain-washed valley into a landscape glowing with quiet hope. Horses waited patiently beneath towering cedar trees while silver banners fluttered gently in the cool mountain breeze. Abigail Carter stood at the edge of the forest path wearing the charcoal cloak Nathaniel Blackwood had entrusted to her, its warmth resting lightly across her shoulders like a promise she had never expected to receive. She watched the royal guards secure their equipment, exchange respectful greetings with the hunters, and form neat lines along the winding mountain road. Everything felt peaceful now, yet the peacefulness carried a quiet certainty that life would never return to what it had been before the storm. Nathaniel approached her one final time before mounting his horse. The morning light reflected softly in his familiar silver eyes, the same eyes that had once watched her from beneath rain-soaked black fir beside the ancient oak. Neither of them hurried to speak. Some moments carried too much meaning for unnecessary words. Abigail gently reached into the pocket of her cloak and removed the silver ring she had protected since dawn. She held it out with both hands. Nathaniel accepted it carefully before fastening it beside its matching companion. Together the two pieces once again formed the complete royal crest, not because of magic, but because they had finally returned to where they belonged. He smiled quietly. You kept your promise. Abigail returned the smile. So did you. Nathaniel looked toward the towering oak standing peacefully behind them. Whenever I remember the night the storm nearly convinced me to surrender, I will remember that one person chose compassion instead of fear. Abigail lowered her eyes for a moment before answering softly. Whenever I hear rain upon the roof of my little cottage, I think I will remember that not every stranger is meant to remain one. A gentle laugh escaped Nathaniel, light and genuine, perhaps the first truly unburdened laughter he had known in many years. Captain Elias Bennet respectfully approached, reminding the king that the road to the capital awaited. Nathaniel nodded before climbing into the saddle with effortless grace. For one final moment he looked down at Abigail standing beneath the towering cedars. Black Hollow will always have a place in the kingdom, he said. Then his expression softened. And so will the healer who reminded her king what courage truly looks like. The procession began moving slowly along the mountain road, disappearing little by little between ancient pines shimmering beneath the morning sun. Abigail remained where she stood until the last silver banner vanished beyond the distant ridge. Only then did she quietly turn toward the narrow forest trail leading home. The ancient oak still stood exactly where she had first discovered the wounded black wolf, its roots wrapped firmly around the earth as though protecting every memory left beneath its branches. Abigail rested one hand against the weathered bark before smiling to herself. The forest no longer felt lonely. It felt alive with quiet gratitude. As she continued walking toward her small cottage carrying her basket of herbs, birds filled the trees with cheerful songs while sunlight danced across the dew-covered grass. Somewhere high upon the distant cliffs overlooking the valley, a magnificent black wolf appeared for only a brief moment against the golden horizon. He stood proudly beneath the bright morning sky before lifting his head in one clear, peaceful howl that drifted across the mountains like a heartfelt farewell. Abigail paused, listening until the final note disappeared into the wind. She smiled without looking back because somehow she already knew exactly who had offered that silent promise. And from that day forward, whenever the people of Black Hollow spoke about true strength, they no longer began with stories of warriors or kings. They remembered the quiet Omega who had looked beyond fear, chosen kindness without expecting anything in return, and forever changed a kingdom simply by refusing to walk away from one wounded soul.